Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, we have been discussing the Canki Sutta, which is Sutta number 95 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And as we saw, even though this sutta begins with a visit by the Brahmin Canki to the Buddha, the Brahmin after whom the sutta is named, by about a third of the way through the sutta, the Brahmin Canki fades out of the picture, and I think he doesn't reappear, not even at the end. And so the core of the sutta focuses upon a dialogue between the Buddha and a Brahmin youth named Kappatika. The Brahmin youth has been trying to argue for the absolute authority, the absolute truthfulness of the Brahminic scriptures, the Vedas. And first he claims, out of faith, that the Vedas are absolute truth. Then he claims that the Vedas have come down through an oral tradition, and therefore they have to be accepted as truth, since they've come down through an ancient line or lineage of teachers. Then the Buddha points out that there are 5 authorities or 5 sources of authority that people appeal to as a basis for truth claims. These are faith, then approval or personal preference, then oral tradition, then reasoning, you say, inferential reasoning. And then the 5th is reflection, pondering upon a view, and then accepting it as a result of one's reflections. And the Buddha points out that even though these 5 might be cited as the basis for truth, but none of them are sufficient in themselves to guarantee the truth of a claim or a proposition. The reason is that any of these can have 2 consequences. What it is brought forward to support might be true, or it might be false. Having faith in something doesn't guarantee its truth. One might have very strong faith. What one believes in, it might be true, but the faith doesn't guarantee the truth of what one believes. Similar with the personal preference, one might have a strong liking for a particular teaching or religion, but just having the liking or preference for that religion doesn't guarantee its truth. A religion might be supported by sacred scriptures which have come down from ancient times. They've all been accepted by many generations of people who are considered wise and holy. And on this basis, one might claim that what is taught in these scriptures must be true. But in fact, the scriptures might have come down very accurately from generation to generation, but what they teach might be wrong. Again, the 4th is reasoning or inferential reasoning. One might reason with a great deal of accuracy, precision, care, every step following with absolute logic, with compelling logic from the previous steps. But if one starts with some wrong premises, then the more tight and rigorous you make your system, the further you're straying from the truth. And then the 5th is reflective acceptance of a view. One might reflect very deeply upon a particular view. As a result of the reflection, one comes to accept that view, but just reflecting on a view is not a basis for upholding it and proclaiming that this is truth, anything else is false. Okay, so then the Buddha says that if a person, now I'm in paragraph 15, I'm just reviewing what I covered last week. In order for there to be the preservation of truth, we have to recognize the limitations of these 5 courts of appeal to which people turn as a basis for truth. And admit that one could say that one has this particular faith, one has this particular preference, one accepts this oral tradition, one has reasoned out such and such conclusions, one accepts such views as a basis of reflection. And if one just states that much, then one is speaking what is valid, what is truth. But on that basis, one doesn't come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. If one keeps within those limits, observes those precautions, then one is preserving truth. One is protecting truth from the encroachment by dogmatic claims to certainty. Okay, so then the Buddha says, summing up that passage, he says, in this way, Bharadvaja would be probably the family name of this young Brahmin. In this way, Bharadvaja, there is the preservation of truth. In this way, one preserves truth. In this way, we describe the preservation of truth. But as yet, there is no discovery of truth. Now the Buddha has opened up a new topic by saying that there is such a thing as discovery of truth. We're not committed to perpetual uncertainty, perpetual speculation about truth. We're not confined within the limits of our faith or our preferences. But there is a way to discover truth, to realize truth, to see truth. And so by making that statement, he's sort of provoking the young Brahmin Kappatika to ask about the discovery of truth. And so Bharadvaja, Kappatika, picks up the Buddha's statement and says, in what way, Master Gotama, is there the discovery of truth? In what way does one discover truth? We ask Master Gotama about the discovery of truth. And the Pali expression here, such anubodha, it's related to the word bodhi, which means enlightenment. We have such anubodha. Yeah, the word anubodha comes from the root bhuj, or the verb bhujati, which means, originally it meant to awaken, then it came to mean to understand, comprehend. Then anu has the sense of in accordance with. So this is an understanding that is in accordance with truth. Or we could say it's an initial awakening to truth. And so Kappatika asks about how the discovery of truth takes place. And then the Buddha will present a sequential teaching showing the steps that lead to the penetration or realization of truth. Okay, we begin here in paragraph 17, that a bhikkhu, that's a monk, may be living in dependence upon some village or town. And now a householder or a householder's son, this is the person who wants to attain some realization of truth, goes to him and investigates him in regard to three kinds of states. In regard to states based on greed, in regard to states based on hatred, and in regard to states based on delusion. And the reason why he makes this investigation, he wants to know, are there in this Venerable One any states, mental states, based on greed or hatred or delusion, such that with his mind obsessed by those states, while not knowing he might say, I know, or while not seeing he might say, I see, or he might urge others to act in a way that would lead to their harm and suffering for a long time. And then this is very similar to the investigation of the Buddha that was undertaken in the previous sutta we discussed, in the Vimamsaka Sutta, the Sutta on investigation. Here one looks trying to determine the quality of a person's mind on the basis of his behavior. So when he investigates him, he comes to see that there are no such states based on greed in this venerable monk. The bodily behavior and the verbal behavior of this Venerable One are not those of one affected by greed. So here the criteria that he uses to determine the mental state of the prospective teacher is his bodily behavior and the verbal behavior, his speech. But just on the basis of bodily action and speech, one can't tell directly the quality of the mind. But one then looks into the teaching that this Venerable One gives, the Dhamma, and he realizes that this Dhamma that the Venerable One teaches is profound, hard to see, and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. This Dhamma cannot easily be taught by one influenced by greed, by somebody in the grip of greed. This is because the Dhamma is something which leads to the true Dhamma, which is something that leads to the overcoming, the eradication of greed and craving. And so if somebody is really in the deep grip or in the strong grip of greed and craving, then he won't want to proclaim a teaching which is directed towards the elimination of greed. And also it's quite important, I think, to note here that when the Buddha is speaking about the discovery of truth, he doesn't mean simply finding out true facts about the world, such as we might find by reading a history book or a science textbook. To find out what is true in history, of course one has to check the credentials of the historian, of the writer, to make sure that the person is well qualified and has solid knowledge and is not relating history from a biased point of view, a interested point of view where he's trying to defend a certain interpretation of history in order to secure his own interests or the interest of his country or his community. And similarly, somebody can be a perfectly qualified scientist and discover some of the most astonishing truths about the physical world, the chemical world, the biological world, while still being a very morally corrupted person. But here we are speaking about, or the Buddha is speaking about the realization of spiritual truth, of liberating truth. And this truth can only be properly proclaimed and properly represented by one who embodies that truth, the realization of that truth, in his own being, in his own person. of course, many of those who teach the Dhamma still have minds which are, to some extent, maybe even to a strong degree, influenced by greed, hatred, and delusion. But the important criterion is whether this person is earnestly dedicated to the path that leads to the overcoming of these defilements. So here, during the time of the Buddha, there were many enlightened disciples, and so the Buddha could appeal directly to them. In the present day, we have to look very, very carefully to distinguish who is at least qualified to speak about the Dhamma and who will give an accurate, truthful representation of it. Okay, so first the investigating householder examines the monk with regard to greed, and he comes to the conclusion that there are no states based on greed, or that on the basis of the bodily behavior and speech of this Venerable One, that there are no states based on greed in this one. Similarly, he performs an examination, investigation in regard to states based on hatred. If the teacher starts angrily condemning other teachers of his own faith, or if he starts angrily condemning the teachings of other religions, denouncing followers of other religions, if he speaks very furiously, trying to whip up vehement hatred in his listeners, one could determine that this is even a very dangerous person, and it would be very risky to try to follow his teaching. So one has to see that the teacher is one ideally completely free from manifestations of hatred in his behavior, or at least that through his bodily action and his speech, he indicates that he's had some success in reducing these defilements and is on the way to their elimination. And next, he investigates the teacher with regard to states based on delusion. This is the most difficult to tell, but one could see by the actions of the teacher whether he seems confused, uncertain in his actions, whether he behaves in improper ways. And from his speech, he doesn't have to be omniscient, but of course he won't be omniscient. But if he makes very confused statements, seems irrational in his argumentation, then one could tell that there's some degree of delusion in him. But if he seems very straight, wise in his delivery of his teaching, if his teaching seemed to have solid basis in one's own experience, solid basis in fact, then one could come to a reasonable conclusion that this Venerable One, even if he hasn't eliminated delusion completely, has made substantial progress in reducing it and is on the way following the practice for the eradication of delusion. Okay, so when the householder has investigated this prospective teacher and seen that he is free or purified of states based on delusion, then he places faith in him. And here we come across that word again, faith. So where does the faith that the Buddha is encouraging here differ from that being endorsed by the young Brahmin?
Well, the Brahmin was saying that faith was enough to claim truth.
Yeah.
But here the Buddha is saying faith is necessary on the way to discovery.
Exactly, right. Exactly.
It's not the end.
Exactly. Yeah, for the Brahmins, faith was the guarantee of the truth of what they believed. The fact that they believed in this particular set of scriptures and the claims made in these scriptures, For them, that meant that the scriptures had to be true. And not only the Brahmins, but many other people believe in a particular spiritual teaching, particular religion, and because they have faith in that teaching, they become very emotionally carried away by their faith, and they say, therefore, this must be true. Of course, usually they don't put it so explicitly, but just through their faith, they claim that the teachings are true. But here, faith means that one is inspired by the presence of this person, that one has some trust and confidence in the teacher as somebody who is capable of showing one the path to realization of truth. Basically, one has faith that this person has attained realization himself, herself, or that the person has made some progress towards the realization of truth, or that the person is on the way towards the realization of truth. But in the ideal case, one would have the faith that this is a person who has truly realized the truth. Okay, so then when one places faith in the teacher, then one visits him and pays respect to him. And in ancient India, religious teachings were not written down in books, so you didn't go to the bookshop and buy some of the collected teachings of this teacher. You didn't turn on your computer and go to Amazon.com and order the books. But to learn spiritual teachings, you actually had to come into the presence of a teacher. First, one might inquire from some of his followers, what is this teacher's teaching? And so you would pick up or learn the teacher's teaching by hearsay. But just getting the knowledge by hearsay is not sufficient. One has to hear it from the teacher himself. One has to come into the teacher's presence. And so one visits the teacher, or the word literally upasankamana means approaching, and goes to the teacher and pays respect to him. Of course, one of the criteria or expectations for receiving spiritual teachings in the Indian background is that one shows respect towards the teacher. Of course, if the teacher is giving a public talk, a public discourse, then many people curious to hear the teaching will come to learn what he has to teach. But to get personalized instructions and to get detailed guidance in practice, one comes and one shows respect to the teacher. Okay, then when one gives respect, one gives ear. That means that one listens, because one is dependent for the direct knowledge of the teacher's teaching upon listening to what he has to say. And so then when one gives ear, then one hears his teaching, the Dhamma. Having heard the Dhamma, then one, maybe the word memorizes is a bit strong, dharana, which means retains it in mind. But in India, during the time of the Buddha, since it was basically pretty much a pre-literate or non-literate culture, the capacity of people's memories were much greater than they are today. Nowadays, because we've become so dependent upon books and print and other media of communication, that our memories the capacities of our memories have shrunk a great deal. They've diminished, and so we have a lot of trouble memorizing even just a few words, even lists of Pali words or Chinese words, Chinese ideograms. But in the days of the Buddha, there were, of course, the Brahmins would transmit their scriptures by oral transmission. And so the Brahmins had trained their memories to become extremely voluminous so they could retain great masses of texts. And the Buddhist monks also would they would be divided into communities that would specialize in different collections of texts, the different nikayas or agamas. This was for 400 years the teachings were transmitted in that way, before they were written down. And so monks would memorize, some would memorize a whole nikaya, some would memorize the whole Vinaya Pitaka, some whole volumes of Abhidharma or philosophical texts. Then I'm sure when the texts were first being written down, there were the old-time monks who looked at the younger ones, starting to write the text down in book form using their ola leaf, palm leaves, and some stylus to do the writing. They would have shook their heads and said, now the teaching is degenerating. It's on its last legs. It won't last much longer. But those who are writing were thinking, oh, but this is the way to keep the teaching for a long time. In this way we'll have the words of the doctrine in written form in books. Then we could pass them down. They don't depend on our weak and fragile memories. So there must have been a debate going on. And eventually the book writers, the book compilers won out. And so we have now the Buddha scriptures are all written down in books. But the old system of oral transmission and oral preservation of memorization still remains in Buddhist countries, in especially the ones who are most accomplished in memorization are the Burmese monks. They memorize. There are some monks, perhaps even alive today, but there was one very, very famous in the middle. He died, I think, in the 1980s, called the Jetavan Soyador, who had memorized the entire Tripitaka. And so if one just recites any passage in the Tripitaka, you start reading the first few words, immediately he'll know the passage, pick it up, and then continue reciting it. And he was tested very, very rigorously by the Burmese elders. And so he was given the honorary position when they had the 6th Buddhist Council in Burma. He was the respondent to the questions on the Dhamma. Okay, so one hears the teaching, then learns it by memory to retain it in mind. But it's not enough merely to retain the teaching in mind, but one has to go further and examine the meaning of the teachings in order to understand what is being communicated, what is being conveyed. Then when the meaning comes to light, not only the surface meaning, but one investigates to try to ferret out the subtle implications, the deep underlying implications of the teaching, to see the structure of the teaching, the implications, to see the bearings of the teaching upon one's own experience, and one examines them in the light of one's own experience, then at a certain point one gains what is called here a reflective acceptance of these teachings. This is a quite interesting Pali word. Dhamma nijjhana kanti. Yeah, the word kanti here is the same as the Pali word that's used to mean patience. It's like the Sanskrit kshanti. Like we have the kshanti paramita. But here, what's common to the both senses of kanti is that of acceptance, In the case of being patient, one accepts hardship, abuse, and even torture from others. One accepts difficult conditions, pain, affliction. But Canki also signifies the acceptance of a teaching. It has an intellectual element as well. And then this acceptance comes about by nijjhana. Nijjhana comes from you might recognize the word jhana, which often it's used in Buddhist texts to mean meditation or meditative absorption. But here one is not yet into the stage of deep meditative absorption, but one has deeply thought out or contemplated the teaching, pondered it inside and out when one is examining the teaching. And then as a result of that, one accepts the Dhamma, the teaching. Okay, then when one accepts the teaching through as a result of reflection, then something called chanda arises. Here, Venerable Nyanamoli had translated it zeal. I'm not sure I especially like that word now. I prefer to use simply desire. But sometimes chanda as desire has a bad meaning. It's then equivalent to craving or greed. But also chanda has a good meaning. It's the desire for spiritual advancement, the desire for realization of truth. And this is the desire that propels one into action, that will enable one, that will make one fit for the realization of truth. Okay, then when that desire has arisen, or zeal, then usahati, he applies his will, or actually usahati implies, I prefer to render it simply that one makes an effort in practice. One undertakes the exertion, the effort to achieve realization. And here I think the idea of applying the will or making the effort could include just about every aspect of mental training, of training the mind. Or at least let's say the preliminary levels of mental training. The effort to take up a meditation, taking up the action, the work of taking up a meditation subject, using it to help to purify the mind, to strive and cultivate, to eliminate the unwholesome or obstructive mental states, to develop and strengthen wholesome mental states, and then eventually to gain deeper levels of samadhi, of concentration. Okay, then when one has made this effort and practice, gained some degree of mental composure, mental collectedness or one-pointedness, then the Buddha says, one scrutinizes. Okay, scrutinization here, the Pali word, I think the verb is tuleti. The word tula, the noun on which it's based, means a scale that one uses for weighing things. And so what one is doing is now sort of measuring things, weighing things, not in the sense of the earlier of reflection on the teaching, but now according to the commentary, what one is doing now is investigating with insight. This is the development of Vipassana, of insight into the three characteristics of existence, the three universal marks of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and anatta, selflessness, the absence of any ego self. And so as one is developing this direct investigative insight, one comes to penetrate more and more, to see more and more clearly these three characteristics of existence. But then there might come a point where the practice sort of balances out and the mind becomes very stable and equanimous. And if one becomes attached to that calm equanimity, that mental stability, then one will settle down in it and become satisfied with it, which is a kind of complacency. And so to reach true realization, one has to make a further effort. And this is what I take to be implied by here, padahati. He strives. He makes the strong exertion to attain realization. And then the Buddha says, he strives, and then resolutely striving, bahitattahu. He realizes with the body the supreme truth and sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. Here I wrote the Pali down because the Pali, it's very pregnant with meaning, which in English just gets a little bit diluted. Here, kayena means the body. And this seems to imply that the experience is so powerful and almost shattering, powerful and shattering, that it seems almost as though it's a physical experience. It probably has a tremendous impact, though it takes place in the mind, that realization, but it has an impact which spreads through the whole physical body. So with the body, one realizes the Paramasatchang. And what is this Paramasatchang, the supreme truth? This is the truth, the ultimate truth, which is nirvana or nibbana. So what has been happening now in the process of this person's meditative practice is that he has been contemplating with insight the three characteristics of all conditioned phenomena, seeing that they are all impermanent. Because they're impermanent, they are unsatisfactory, liable to suffering, inadequate, flawed. And because they're impermanent and because they are flawed with suffering, they are not to be taken as self. And through penetrating or through investigating with insight more and more deeply into these three characteristics of conditioned phenomena, and then making that extra push, that extra effort through striving, there comes a point in the practice where all conditioned phenomena fall away and the mind comes face to face with that reality, that truth, that state which exists of its own, not dependent on causes and conditions. And that state, that reality, that unconditioned reality, that is the supreme truth, or nibbana, nirvana. Nirvana, according to the early Buddhist scriptures, is not just a state of peace or bliss, but it is a reality to be penetrated and realized. And so this is what's happening now with this person's practice. So he realizes with the body, with the mind, but so powerfully that it seems almost as if it's a physical experience. He realizes it as the supreme truth, and then with wisdom, he penetrates into it and sees it as it really is. And this is the discovery of truth, the awakening to truth. But then the Buddha adds, at the end of the sequence, he adds another sentence. But as yet, there is no final arrival at truth. So this seems to raise the question. It would seem that having done all of this work of first learning, examination, reflection, applying the will, examining, scrutinizing, striving, then realizing the truth, it seems with that one should come to the end of the path with nothing further to be done. But that is not the case. Because what the Buddha teaches is that realization or penetration of truth takes place in certain distinct layers or levels. And there are, in the ancient teaching, 4 levels. We don't have to go into them now, but we distinguish them into 2 basic levels, 2 more basic levels. Okay, the 2 basic levels are, one is called the Seika, which means the learner or trainee, or also can be called the disciple in higher training. This is one who has penetrated the truth of the Buddha's teaching through direct experience, and thereby becomes permanently equipped with the factors of training, with the qualities of training, the qualities needed to achieve final realization. So once a person becomes a Seika, a trainee, he can never fall back to the level of an ordinary person. The ordinary person is called in the Pali text Puthujjana, which means literally many folk. Or we can say common people, or so common people now in America has become the favorable expression. Especially by politicians, they all want to have the support of the common people. But maybe the English rendering, not very literal, but that gets the sense most adequately is, we'll all have to hang our heads down in shame. Worldling. Yeah, the worldling, the Puthujjana, this is a person who doesn't have any realization at all, or has not yet reached any stage of realization at all. But worldlings are said to be of 2 kinds. One is the ordinary worldling, the real worldling, a person who's really engrossed in the world, preoccupied with worldly interests, worldly desires. And then the other is called the noble-minded worldling, the worldling who has been inspired by the Dhamma, who accepts the teaching and is making an earnest effort to practice it. And so the sequence begins when the householder comes up to the monk and investigates and plants faith, establishes faith in the teacher. At that point, this person becomes a good or noble-minded worldling. Then through all of the stages of practice, from listening to the teaching up to striving, with resolutely striving, he's still a noble-minded worldling. But when he makes that breakthrough to the penetration of truth, to the realization of the supreme truth, with that he becomes a trainee, a learner, a seika. And what brings the attainment of the stage of trainee is dasana, or Sanskrit darshana, which means seeing the truth of the teaching. The truth, the supreme truth of the unconditioned has become opened up to mental vision, to inner realization. And one sees this truth, the supreme truth, and the subtle, or let's say the coarsest layer of ignorance gets destroyed, eradicated, exploded. And so one who has seen the truth of the teaching can no longer deny the truth of the teaching, can no longer accept any other doctrine that goes contrary to the Dhamma. Such a one now has, we call, unshakable faith or unshakable confidence, unwavering confidence in the Buddha as the supreme teacher, in the Dhamma as the reliable or true teaching, and in the Aryan Sangha, the community of noble ones, as the supreme field of merit for the world. And in terms of the mental kleshas or defilements, attaining this vision of the truth eliminates, eradicates the coarsest defilements, but there are still many subtler defilements which remain to be eliminated. And when one succeeds in eliminating all the defilements, then one attains full and permanent realization of truth, or attainment of truth. And with that one becomes seika. Seika, it means literally non-learner, non-trainee. But this doesn't mean that, this doesn't refer to a person who sits around on the couch with his feet up on a footstool, drinking from a can of beer and watching the football games on, now it's the baseball season, I think, baseball games on television. But this is a person who's a non-trainer, non-trainee in the sense of completing the training. We could say it's one who's become perfectly accomplished in the training. And then what brings the transition from the stage of trainee to the stage of non-trainee? In technical, or in the terms of the doctrine, the non-trainee is the arahant, the liberated one. So what brings the transition from the stage of trainee to the stage of arahant? That is the question which is being raised when the Buddha speaks about the final arrival of truth. So the Brahmin youth Kapatika says, in what way is there the final arrival of truth? In what way does one finally arrive at truth? We ask Master Gotama about the final arrival of truth. And here the Buddha doesn't have to give a long explanation, but he says the final arrival of truth lies in the repetition, development, and cultivation of those very same things. And here I wrote the key word here is bhavana, which means development or cultivation. And these things to be cultivated are basically the practice of the four foundations of mindfulness, or the development of tranquility and insight. And when, or the noble, you could say, the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, or the 5 spiritual faculties. But in this sutta, the Buddha is referring to the previous process that he's described. One doesn't have to learn and memorize the teaching anymore or gain a reflective acceptance of them, but one has to continue applying one's will. One has to continue scrutinizing phenomena to see more and more deeply into their real characteristics. One has to continue striving, resolutely striving. And when this happens, then one comes to the final arrival at truth, full realization of the truth, which eliminates all ignorance and all the other defilements, craving, grasping, clinging, greed, anger, delusion, that spring up from ignorance. Okay, so now the Brahmin youth asked the Buddha, okay, he says, in this way there is the final arrival at truth, in that way one finally arrives at truth, and so on. But we ask, Master Gotama, what is most helpful for the final arrival at truth? We ask Master Gotama, what is the thing most helpful for the final arrival at truth? Then the Buddha says, striving is most helpful for the final arrival at truth. Why? Because if one doesn't strive, then one won't arrive at truth. But it's when one strives that one can arrive at the truth. Okay, then what is the most helpful thing for striving? Scrutiny or scrutinization. Okay, then what is the most helpful for scrutiny? Applying the will, or making this effort and practice, helps in scrutiny. Then what is the most helpful thing for application of the will? To arouse this zeal or desire. And what is the most helpful for the arousing this zeal? Reflective acceptance of the teaching. Then what is the most helpful for reflective acceptance of the teaching? Examination of the meaning. What is the most helpful for examination of the meaning? Memorizing the teachings, or retaining the teachings in mind. And what is most helpful for retaining the teachings in mind? Hearing the teaching is most helpful. Then what is the most helpful thing for hearing the teaching? The most helpful thing is giving ear or listening to the teaching. And what is the most helpful thing for giving ear? Paying respect. What is the most helpful thing for paying respect? We ask about the most helpful for paying respect. Visiting a teacher is most helpful. Then what is the most helpful thing for visiting? We ask about the thing most helpful for visiting. Faith is the most helpful faith is most helpful for visiting. If faith in a teacher doesn't arise, one will not visit him. But because faith in a teacher arises, one visits him. That is why faith is most helpful for visiting. And so what's interesting here is now the whole sequence that leads to final realization eventually comes back to saddha, or faith. But this, as we said earlier, it's not the blind faith, the unquestioning faith, dogmatic faith, just based upon trusting something completely and then declaring that this is truth. But this is faith, as we said earlier, that motivates one to enter upon the path of practice, the way of training. And the faith itself doesn't guarantee truth, but it's the faith that enables one to set out on that step-by-step process that culminates in the realization of truth. And so at the end, the young Brahmin Kapattika, he praises the Buddha, saying that, or he expresses his appreciation to the Buddha, that we asked Master Gautama about the preservation of truth, and then the Master answered about the preservation of truth. We approve of and accept that answer, and so we are satisfied. And so he goes back and mentions the other topics that he asked about and how the Buddha satisfied him with his answers. Basically the three themes are the preservation of truth, the discovery of truth, and the final arrival or full realization of truth. So whatever we asked Master Gautama about, that he has answered us. We approve of and accept that answer, and so we are satisfied. And then he makes a confession. He says, formerly, Master Gautama, we, that is, well, he's referring to himself, but with that word we, he also indicates the Brahmins in general. If you remember earlier, I spoke about a kind of rivalry or antagonism between the two religious communities in India of this period. The Brahmins, who preserved the Vedas, who married and raised families and performed the ritualistic the rituals and sacrifices, as well as indulging in their own speculations and constructing their philosophical systems. And the other were the Shramanas or Samanas, the renunciant ascetics, who gave up family, clan, caste status, and gave up home and wandered homelessly, practicing asceticism, meditating, developing their philosophical views. So Kapattika says, formerly we used to think, who are these bald-pated recluses, these swarthy or dark menial offspring of the kinsman feet, that they would understand the Dhamma. Here the Dhamma doesn't mean the Buddha's teaching, but it seems to mean the truth about the nature of things. And what is meant by the kinsman with a capital K? It actually means Brahma, the supreme God of the Brahmins. And according to the Brahmins' idea, it was Brahma who created the world and then created all the different classes created all living beings and created the different classes, social classes of human beings. And in the Brahminic scriptures, it is said that the Brahmins were born from the mouth of Brahma. The Kshatriyas were the administrative class, the warrior class. They were born from the arms of Brahma. Of course, Brahma uses his arms to lift things, a sign of strength. The Vaishyas are the merchants and agriculturalists. They are born from the thighs of Brahma. Of course, the thighs are what support the rest of the body. And so it's this great class of tradesmen and agriculturalists who support the upper echelons of society with their labor. Then the lower part of the Shudras are the menial workers. They are said to be born from the, what do you call this? No, not the feet. The shins, or calves of Brahma. The lower part of the legs. Since the Shudras are the ones who do the low work for society. They are the ones, the manual workers, servants, cleaning people. And then to add insult to injury, they said about the shramanas, the ascetics, or renunciate ascetics, they are born from the feet of Brahma. And you have to really get the force of this. You have to realize that in India in this time, people walked around generally barefoot. And so the feet went right up against the ground and picked up all of the dirt from the ground. And so this was a way of saying that the shramanas are the dregs of society. So this was a kind of insult to the shramanas. But now the Brahman youth goes on and says, but now Master Gotama has inspired in me love for recluses, confidence in recluses as shramanas, confidence in recluses, and reverence for recluses. Then the standard formula for going for refuge, he says, the magnificent Abhikantang Bo Gotamo, Abhikantang Bo Gotama, magnificent Master Gotama, excellent Master Gotama. Then he says, I go, the statement comes, the Master Gotama has explained the Dhamma to me in many ways, just as if, well, you could go to Sutta 91, paragraph 37. Yeah, Master Gotama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden. It's page 753. He has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been upside down, revealing what was hidden, showing the right path to one who is lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to Master Gotama for refuge, and to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. From today, let Master Gotama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life. Actually, that's where our present sutta ends. Now it's interesting in the Pali text, generally when somebody from another social class gets converted and becomes a follower of the Buddha, they say, excellent Bhante, excellent venerable, or magnificent Bhante, magnificent Bhante, magnificent venerable one, magnificent venerable one. Then they say, I go to the Buddha for refuge, I go to the Dhamma for refuge. But when the Brahmins get converted, they still use this Brahminic form of address, Master Gotama, Bo Gotama. And they say, I go to Bhavantang Gotamang, to Master Gotama for refuge. It seems that they still have a little trace of Brahminic conceit that they can't get rid of. Okay, this will be the end of our explanation of the sutta. If there are any questions, comments, please feel welcome to ask or speak. Sukhi. Ask only the more important ones. Yeah. 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 I use realization in the sense of seeing it or experiencing it or seeing it and experiencing it. It's not yet realization, so it could be called realization in that sense. It's not yet realization in the sense of full realization, complete attainment. That comes later with what's called the final, what's here called the final arrival at truth. Well, Nibbana is within the Four Noble Truths. It's the real significance of the Third Noble Truth is Nibbana. Nibbana is the cessation of suffering. So what one happens at this, you see, up until this point, with regard to the Four Noble Truths, one can have we could say that one has some insight into the First Noble Truth, because one is seeing impermanence, suffering, selflessness. So these are aspects of dukkha, the First Noble Truth. And one will have some understanding how craving and ignorance are the origin of suffering. But one will have only a kind of inferential understanding that there is a cessation of suffering. Or this will actually be, you would say, an article of faith. One believes that it's possible to eliminate craving and ignorance and gain freedom from suffering. That there is some state that makes possible that eradication of ignorance and craving. But with the attainment of that experience of realizing the supreme truth, of seeing penetrating it with wisdom, then one actually is at that point realizing or seeing the Third Noble Truth, directly knowing it. And then that also brings confirmation of the Fourth Noble Truth, because one now knows with certainty that this path that one has followed, the Noble Eightfold Path, is what brings the realization of Nibbana. I think this will become clear as we go along from sutta to sutta. Yeah.
The Vipassana, is it same as the vision of the Dhamma, gaining the Dhamma?
That's spoken of in the text, this arising of the vision of Dhamma, that expression. It's exactly the same. It's the same, yeah. Yeah.
You said there are two different jhana.
Yeah. Putujana, yeah.
The ignorant average people, and then intelligent or noble.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Now, what's the Pali word for noble-minded worthy?
Yeah. The Pali expression is kalyana putujana. The distinction used in the text, and this distinction comes not in the suttas, it's made in the commentaries. Yeah, it's kalyana putujana. It means a person who's kalyana means good, lofty. We have the expression kalyana mita, it would mean a good spiritual friend, spiritual benefactor. And then the opposite of that is andaputujana, which means blind worldly. The ordinary person who has no interest in Dharma and spiritual teachings, no inclination to practice.
What is the
Sappurisa. Sappurisa means a good person, a noble-minded person.
Is Sappurisa one of the Putujana, or are they Aryan?
Generally, it's used in the sense of the Aryans, the noble ones. But it can, I think, sometimes it's used, it isn't a very technical term. So it could also perhaps include the Kalyana Putujana.
They can be a stream enterer.
A stream enterer, once returner, non-returner. And those on the path for those attainments. But at this point, I don't want to introduce these technical distinctions. We'll come to them as we go on in studying the suttas. Any other question? I have an interesting question. okay, this whole process begins with faith, right? And through faith, one accepts the teaching, one practices and attains realization. So the question is, how can one ever be certain that the realization that one has achieved at the end is not been sort of biased and influenced by one's faith? In such a way that it's the faith that determines the content of the realization, the meaning and significance of the realization. Like, for example, okay, Hindus, Hindu yogis, they say our spiritual teaching doesn't depend only on blind faith. You need faith at the beginning, but then you practice our type of yoga, maybe it's called jnana yoga or raja yoga. Then you come to the realization of the infinite, universal Atman, the self, the all-pervading, all-embracing self, the supreme reality. And so somebody starts off with the faith in this Hindu yogi, practices the teaching, and then at some point will have an experience and think, that's the vision of the Atman or the realization of the Atman that confirms it. Or else there can be, though it's not typical, but we could see maybe Christian thinkers influenced by the scientific approach. They say, we're not asking you to place blind belief in the healing power of Jesus, but just trust yourself to it. Just try it out. Reciting, go pray, and see what happens to you as a result of your prayer. And so you have enough faith for some reason in this process. One goes to the church or in one's own private shrine and prays, "Oh God, oh Jesus, help me, please have mercy on me." And then one goes on maybe practicing over and over again. The mind becomes very calm and settled because the mind is becoming concentrated. Then one will experience waves of light and bliss coming through. And sometimes even when one really devotes oneself to some spiritual ideal, I don't know how to explain this, but it does happen, like seemingly miraculous or inconceivable coincidences take place, which further confirms one's trust in that teaching. And so these experiences will then confirm to this person, yes, there is an all-loving, all-knowing God. And since I've prayed in this way, Jesus must be looking after me and taking care of me and helping me. And so this convinces him of the truth of Christianity. So in each case, the faith is conditioning some experience which seems to confirm the truth of that teaching. Yeah.
Firstly, I mean, regardless of the theory, I come to you because I read your Dhamma book, and I examined it, and then I have a trust in what you were saying. Then we go to that teacher. So there is that kind of faith in coming to you. Because if I read something and then that's full of baloney, then I won't go. So it started something like it's like trusting certain friends. Even if they make mistakes, I know they're a good nature. So I trust that person. So start with like that. Then here you have to examine scrutiny and examination. In the process of examination, if I find you have a mix, not just wholesome, half wholesome and half
Yeah.
unwholesome,
Yeah.
then I won't have like 100% faith.
Yeah. 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 Okay, but somebody like the Hindu follower can have examined the behavior of the Swami, say, or Sadhu for a long time and sees that the behavior is, I mean, there are some Hindu Swamis who are very admirable in their behavior. Those who gain samadhi, they have very pure minds, sometimes spiritual powers, a lot of wisdom in dealing with daily life, deep experience in meditation. But their whole system is based on the idea of the Atman, the Supreme Self.
So they're not examining the Atman itself.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Maybe so. I don't have an answer to this question. But it's a question that's occurred to me. Does one ever come to a spiritual realization that is not in some way circumscribed or limited by the initial faith one places in the teaching?
The goal, as I understand it, of Buddhism is to realize an ending of suffering.
Yeah.
So one can really say, is there a difference between honestly experiencing the end of the suffering and only thinking you're experiencing the end of the suffering? If you're not suffering, you're not suffering.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, I guess that's really what we have to, if there is a real difference. If there isn't, then it's self-evident if you reach the goal or not.
Yeah. Perhaps that's it. In the back. Yeah. Actually, that's a very good point. And I think one thing that's quite distinctive about the Buddha's teaching is that the Buddha says, in contrast to all the others, he says, don't cling even to the Dhamma, to the teaching. Even clinging to the Dhamma in the subtlest way is a subtle point of attachment, which one has to get rid of. Even the teaching of anatta, the teaching of non-self, or the teaching of dependent origination, he says, you use it like a raft, but you don't set it up as an absolute truth. Okay, I think we'll have to stop now. And next week, this sort of concludes the section of our sutta study dealing with the approach to the Dhamma. Approaching the Dhamma. Now, next week we start with the ethical teachings of early Buddhism, taking up Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 46, the great discourse on the ways of undertaking things. Okay, let us share the merits. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi 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 siddhya.